Hello everyone, thank you for joining us today. Together with Nicoleta Ilea and Silvian Cențiu from Retina, one of our member companies, we'll discuss about the transition from crisis to the new world. Before we start, I will kindly ask you to set your microphones on mute during the speeches, to use the Slido platform in order to address your questions, or the raise hand function if you want to speak during the Q&A session. After the webinar, you'll receive the recording and the presentation. I want to thank the Retina team for their help and engagement shown to our community. And I'm glad to introduce the first speaker, Mr. Silvian Centiu. He's a managing partner at Retina, also known as Transferis, a company he co-founded while completing a master at Stanford University. Mr. Centiu, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks for the Deutsche Rumänische Industrie und Handelskammer for organizing this and allowing us to present. We're going to talk to them together with my colleague Nicoleta Ilea. We're going to talk about the transitioning out of the pandemic and how does that result in changes that need to be made in management and communication. And we put together an agenda. We're going to go over introductions. We're going to talk about interactivity for this this presentation. And then to talk about a few topics. We're going to go over a couple of assumptions, and we're going to address just a little. Again, it's we're limited on time, so we're going to talk a little about each of these topics, not in depth. But we're going to talk about a little bit about what do we need to get out. This crisis will need to end, and we need to be prepared, and we'd like to rather plan a transition rather than go along with whatever will happen. And we chose 3 areas that we want to focus on, and those are changes in management. How do we keep productivity and profits going? And we're going to talk in this regard quite a bit about marketing. And marketing is one of the areas where we have significant expertise. And again, we include advertising, but marketing is a larger field that governs all the interactions with markets, positioning, and so on, not just advertising. And then we're going to talk a little bit about digital tools. So we're going to take questions at the end, but as I said, please feel free to ask questions before that as well, using Slido. Now, a couple of introductions. I'm going to introduce myself, and I'm going to introduce Nicoleta. You might want to say hi, Nicoleta, as well. But really quickly, I'm going to give you the word in a second. Really quickly about me, I'm a managing partner with Retina Transferis. I studied a number of things. My career started in engineering, but I studied management as well, namely at Stanford. So I have a master's in management science. And then I studied social sciences as well. And for the last 10 years, I've been working mostly in marketing. I'm currently doing research at Stanford and ASE in Bucharest. I teach a full course at ASE as well, and I teach around the world. I just taught a course at University of Malaga, and prior to that, a few months ago, at a couple of universities in Belarus and in South Korea. I'm going to quickly introduce you Nicoleta as well. Nicoleta is working with our partner company Actas, and is a strategic and innovative HR manager with a focus on developing talent, growing talent, and doing that in the context of the specific organization. I want to give you the opportunity, Nicoleta, to say a few words as well, if you'd like.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. In this webinar, I'm going to focus on the HR part, on the HR documents and situations that we are facing. I have almost 18 years experience in HR, in various fields of HR. And I'm happy to be part of this really fine group of companies. And I'm happy to be here today with you here.
Good. Thank you very much, Nicoleta. And I'm going to mention one aspect really quickly, and that is why are we talking about the pandemic or the crisis or how to get out? It looks like there's no shortage of seminars. Everybody's using the opportunity to speak, to run ideas around, also to promote themselves. And what do we know, or what do we have special to position us for talking on the topic? And I'm going to mention this. We started a company in California about 10 years ago. Even prior to that, I was involved. I was working for a number of companies like Cisco and Oracle and other large international companies, where we participated extensively in geographically distributed teams. Here at Retina, we started from the very beginning with teams that are dispersed around North America and Europe. We have offices in the US and Canada, as well as in Spain, UK, Austria, that serves the DACH, the German space, and Romania. And the way we have serviced our clients is, rather than servicing them locally, we have recruited and placed both best fit talent on our team, regardless of where the customer was located or is located. And in order to do that, we had to develop an environment that is highly conducive to remote work and to collaborating across different geographical locations. We obviously did not anticipate the pandemic, but when the pandemic hit us, we had already the environment in place to be able to continue work pretty much uninterrupted. And that put us at a significant advantage. And also, we'd like to share some of the things that we went through over the years, especially in Romania, in order to enable such an environment. And we think that most companies now will need to implement such an environment. We have quite a bit of experience in doing that. And I think that we can share that experience, and the audience can benefit from that. Okay. Now, as I mentioned before, if you would like to ask questions or make comments, ask for clarifications, or any other interactivity, please go to slide.com, post your questions, vote for other people's questions as well. Okay. Now, let's go a little bit over a few assumptions. First of all, I want to start with saying that the situation is completely unprecedented. Nobody has experience with this. There are obviously people who have experience with crisis. We have experience with working remote or collaborative environments across geographical boundaries. But in terms of the crisis itself and its nature as well as its future, pretty much nobody has a crystal ball. Okay? We don't know what will happen. We don't know exactly what we need to do. And by the way, that adds to uncertainty. We like to be in control. We like to be in a situation where we know what we do. In this particular situation, it is actually useful to know that we're not in control and act accordingly. Most people expect an economic impact. There are significant concerns. There's no shortage of alarm in this particular area. However, there are also those who predict that things will return to where they were before, in one or another, or to some extent. In any case, as I said, there's very little that we know for sure. Okay? Now, most people, or let's put it this way, most people anticipate not just economic changes, but social changes. And they're also both social agents as well as politicians are not only reacting, but also utilizing the crisis for possible changes. At the extreme case, especially if there will be significant economic consequences, there are risks of significant social issues and even possible unrest. What we want to do about that is, as much as possible, obviously prevent it. And how can we prevent it? By returning to work, by creating environments where people can get back to their life and get back to prosperity. We enjoyed, for at least for the last 10 years, quite strong prosperity and pretty much a life or a world or an approach with quite little worry. And this comes in the context of small crises here and there, but we can also look at the fact that for the last maybe a few decades, especially in Europe and North America, we enjoyed peace, we enjoyed prosperity, and with small, let's say, pauses, almost constant growth. Now, to go to more concrete aspects, so we talked about very high-level aspects here. One of the immediate results of the crisis is that we need to find ways to implement social distancing. And what is meant by social distance is, I think most people know, but I'm going to recap, is in every physical location where we are, whether in public, at work, when shopping, and so on, and in parks or on the road, we need to separate. We need to keep apart. We need to wear masks and so on. Now, in terms of work itself, one solution to do that and to avoid crowding in work in the workplace is to work remotely. And whether we work from home or people end up working in separate offices, that will most likely become the norm. In terms of offices, Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, actually a few days ago came out with a study it's actually a combination of study and opinion, where he anticipates that people will make more use of offices rather than less, and there will be a stronger need for offices because people will need to have more space at the workplace. There may be changes where the open space will change back to where we had it before, where there was separation, and separation will probably come back in forms of cubicle or other physical barriers. But quite a few people believe that work from home will increase, and in any case, people will be less close together at work. Okay? And that's something where maybe it will happen to an extent or another, but it's very likely that will happen. Okay? Now, this results in changed business and consumer interaction as well. Again, I'm not going to go into details about that, but we see it already in retail stores. There are only so many customers allowed in a store at a given time. Certain age groups have reserved hours. There's talk about setting paths in stores so that everybody follows a certain path rather than go to anywhere in a store that they need, and so on. Okay? Now, there may be a lot of other businesses that change, whether banks or obviously restaurants and businesses that actually interact extensively with customers, but any other business as well. So both for customers and for employees. One other major change that pretty much we already see and we anticipate for the future as well is the change in the big events, trade shows and other events, where we saw extreme crowding in the past. it's unlikely that those will return anytime soon. Now, one of the things that I want to point out, and we're going to cover it throughout the presentation today, is that quite a few of the changes will probably be trends that we have already witnessed, but these trends will be accelerated. Digital transformation being one of them, but many other things: empowerment of employees, management by results, things that have actually, some of them we have talked or we have implemented in the last 10, 20, 30 years, some of them in the last 60 years, but they are not fully implemented. In some cases, they are very little implemented. And these trends will accelerate. We are talking to my colleagues here in Silicon Valley in California. By the way, I failed to mention that I'm actually right now in California. You probably see it's dark outside. Quite a few of the people that I interact here, both in the industry and in academia, anticipate that these trends will actually accelerate, and there will be maybe here and there a few new items, but we anticipate that maybe 90% of the changes that we'll see will not be anything new, but it will be things that we were either working on or they were present in society, but now they will be adopted to a larger scale, and transformation will be accelerated. Okay? And we're going to talk about a couple of these things on the next slides. Okay? Now, how do we get out of the crisis? The obvious, no question about it, we need to return to work. That is an imperative. It's in order to get normal to any type of normalcy and to pretty much return to economic production, we do need to return to work. Now, obviously, there are health issues and risks with that. We're not going to address them in this particular seminar. It's not our business. There are people addressing that, especially in governments. There are different approaches to that in different countries. There's still other significant debate. But one or another, despite all these issues, sooner or later we will need to return to work. And of course, there are different opinions of how fast, in what circumstances, but there's very little question that eventually we will need to do that. Okay? Now, what we also need to do is we need to anticipate and adapt to the new world, despite all the uncertainty. If we don't do that, we will play along and we will play catch up constantly. So we will not know everything that will happen, but we need to think about it, try different things, see what works, what does not, and also be ready to adapt quickly when we see either a need in society, or we get new trends, or we pretty much we see others doing it as well. Now, one of the things that we need to adapt is services and communication with the market. The obvious changes are, for example, restaurants. They can no longer do business exactly the way they were doing it, let's say 6 months ago. Retailers as well. Obviously, for example, in trade shows will not continue the same way. We will probably travel less and meet less. We will need to move more to online meetings and online interactions. There are many different aspects. For example, documents, whereas we are in the process of moving from signatures and stamping to digital signatures. That change will be accelerated as well. It's very likely that, or let's put it this way, it's unlikely that we will meet and put stamps on documents or sign them. It's very likely that we will send documents to each other and sign them electronically. Of course, this with transformation, there come risks. There will be an accelerated learning curve. There's a risk of security and hacking and so on. But we will have no choice pretty much, and we will need to adapt to this type of services. Now, communication with the market will most likely change as well. with less physical presence. Quite a bit of the communication will need to move to online, and it's not just advertising. Any learning about products, awareness of products, education about products will need to move online as well, and even capturing attention of people, so that in the awareness, branding, and so on, as well as demonstrating and gaining people's attention will need to be adapted to the new world. And this is an area that we have a few slides that we're going to get deeper in. Now, the other major area that we're addressing here is adapting work environment. I also already talked a little bit about that, but that's another general item. Pretty much most adults in one or another are involved in a profession, whether in the private sector, in the public sector, and that environment, excuse me, excuse me, yeah, and that environment will need to adapt as well. And on that, Nicoleta will talk a little bit about a few of the items that we need to adapt. We're not going to go very deep in them either, but we want to paint a little bit a picture of the direction, the kind of things that we need to look at, and how to go about that. Now, as I said before, in both of these areas, whether marketing or HR, we have adapted to a need that's very similar, and that's geographically dispersed services. We have done that to match the best talent in the world with challenges of a specific project. However, even though the reason is different, the means or the environment is very similar, and these procedures and approaches can be leveraged in this particular situation. Okay? Now, communication is not needed just externally, it's needed internally as well. Whereas before, you can actually gather the troops, pretty much you could yell, hey, everybody pay attention to me, and everybody, you could actually send a message really quickly, or if you had to explain or get a point across, it was much easier. You gathered everybody in all hands. That will most likely no longer be possible because people will not be physically present there, and because you want to avoid to crowd everybody into a large meeting room. Again, what we've done is we have done virtual town halls for the last 10 years, virtual all-hand meetings and so on, because we were dispersed geographically. Okay, now, I'm going to talk a little bit about changes in management. We're going to talk about management, about marketing or market positioning, and about the tools. Now, in management, there are a couple of things that need to change as part of remote working. The nature, the relationships, and the management of work itself will most likely be affected if people are not physically in the same office. Now, one of the things that I would like to start with is nothing new. It was developed in the 60s, so maybe 60 years ago. Okay, and that's theory X and theory Y. I'm going, without going in depth into it, of course, that can make the subject by itself of an entire seminar. I'm going to mention really quickly what it is and how it works. And especially in any economy, including the United States or Canada or Western Europe, this is not totally implemented. But especially in Romania, we feel that it's very, very little implemented, and society could benefit from it in general. And in particular, we think that it's a need with remote working. So really quickly, I'm going to talk about theory X, theory Y. It comes, by the way, from a person by the name of McGregor, Douglas McGregor. He published a book called The Human Side of Enterprise. It's quite well known in organizational behavior and HR. And in any case, it goes something like this. Theory X says that people normally, in their nature, will avoid work, will do work only if it's maybe forced upon them, or if they're supervised. and they will avoid especially responsibility at all costs. In such an environment, the job of a manager is to ensure that people actually do their work. So that's the environment that you sometimes see in comedies, where the moment the manager turns their head away, everybody starts playing and throwing paper at each other. And the moment the manager actually turns their head back, everybody sits down and acts like they're working. And that's an environment where managers, in order to ensure output, they need to constantly stay on top of their employees, to verify them, and in most cases to keep an eye on them in a physical setting. Okay? Now, even before the pandemic, so without the need for remote working or social separation, that environment has been highly questionable. However, it's still used to a very large extent in many societies, including in Romania. Now, theory Y says that actually the nature of people is not that they will avoid work. And if in a proper environment, people will regard work just like they regard play or rest. And they will not only will they not avoid responsibility, but they will seek it. Just like people, when they play, they like often to have an active role. They will take initiatives. The same in working. And if the environment is properly set up and managed, people will actually identify with the goals of the organization, take ownership of those goals or their tasks, and will regard their work as enjoyable and fun and natural. And the job of managers is to create such an environment. That's the primary job of a manager, no longer to force people to work, but to create an environment where such a behavior is conducive, is reinforced, and so on. Now, why do we talk about this right now? We talk about this right now because the theory X environment will be very difficult to enforce in a work from home situation. Again, we can say that we don't want it to begin with, but it will be very unlikely to be practical in a work from home or remote work, or the more we're geographically or locally dispersed. Now, if you talk to HR practitioners and some managers as well, they will say, okay, this is an old theory. Why do we even talk about it? The reason why we talk about it is because it's not implemented. It may be old, but it doesn't mean that that people have adopted it. And again, we can actually derive business advantages from it, especially because the theorex environment will most likely break. It will be no longer feasible. Also, managers who have worked their entire life in a theorex environment will not have it easy to change to a theory Y environment. It requires the skills of that environment plus trust and so on. In his book, McGregor also talks about the fact that people who are used with theory X might already be broken, and it will be extremely difficult to make the transition theory Y. And I personally subscribe to that as well. I think that most people who, even out of school, but especially in their first jobs, got conditioned to theory X, they will have even more obstacles to overcome. In any case, this number of people might regard this as theoretical. We believe that this is something that is very practical, and we implemented it over the last 10 years pretty much as a mantra. It has backfired in some cases, and I want to share that with you, and I can tell you why. Especially in Romania, for example, when we promoted such an environment, in the beginning, people who have never seen it and were conditioned to a theory X rather than theory Y, they didn't really believe it. They thought it's one of these things that companies do where they promote a certain culture, but they don't really mean it. Okay, and we had quite a few people who said, "Nah, okay, fine, say whatever. We'll see how it works." There's another aspect there, is that people interact with their friends, their colleagues, their spouses, and if they don't see that in the rest of society, they will have what's called a cognitive dissonance. So that acts against implementing such environments. Obviously, theory of why needs buy-in. Okay, so people need to see the value and try it out and maybe take it seriously. And that has been actually for us we had it much easier to implement it, for example, in the US, where it's I would say more the norm than the exception. But we found out that, for example, in Romania, it was more the exception than the norm, and we had difficulties with implementing that as a social level. Now, when companies implement that, probably that needs to be taken into consideration also because of accelerated implementation. Like with anything else, change needs to be managed, but also because of the effect of the larger society on beliefs and attitudes and perceptions and so on. Okay, now I already mentioned management by results, whereas in a number of companies we have managed people by activities, by their tasks, and we needed to make sure that they perform a task and complete a task. Because of not being able to interact as often or keep an eye on the task itself, management will need to increasingly be based on results. Again, it goes hand in hand with people taking ownership and being able to achieve those results. But in the end, quite a few companies that were not used to that will need to implement programs, train their managers to actually measure output constantly, rather than keep an eye on the constant work and make sure that people are working. Rather, they will need to make sure that they are delivering. Now, one of the other items that is discussed quite a bit in literature is identity culture. We have developed, especially in terms of professions or work, we have developed an approach where we enjoy the capability to move from a company to another. In the US, people have actually moved from a city to another, or even from state to state quite often. And we enjoy that. We like it. We want to be able to do that. And it has been the norm. It's most likely that in the future, we will need to both locally, cities or communities are coming together. In companies, getting a closer identity of employees with employer will most likely increase or needs to increase. It will need to be that, so that we can actually protect ourselves, even in this case of health issues. And we need to trust that if we do get together, the other people that participate in the company keep the same, let's say, health norms or hygiene. And we assume that we already see that society has become extremely intrusive, and personal freedoms have been curtailed quite a bit. We anticipate that it will continue, and it will continue in the workplace as well. Now, that actually, in order to justify it and also to operationalize it, it will most likely increase the identity of people to the organization. Okay, so the accepting or identifying themselves with being a member of that particular organization. Okay. Now, one other aspect that might need to be addressed is the unseparation of work and personal life. That has been an item on people's life to actually separate for the last more than 100 years, to separate work and personal life. It used to be that people, especially, for example, in agriculture, had the two intertwined quite a bit. In recent times, we actually try to separate them as much as possible. We think that the trend will be toward separating them less, especially people working home, having their personal environment, maybe their personal family or household participate in work as well. We see it, for example, in the news now. Quite a few journalists actually report from home, involve some of their some of the people in their household as well. We think that will actually accelerate. Also, because people will actually communicate at the odd times. In this particular case, being locked down, people have even out of boredom worked, for example, during the weekends or off hours. But we see that trend actually continuing, and that's something that we need to manage as well. Okay. Now, last thing that I have here on the list, and it's very obvious, is the use of technology will increase, and it's not just in communication. It's very likely that, for example, in manufacturing, use of technology will increase. It's unlikely that people will be able to work as close together, for example, on assembly lines as they used to. There will be other priorities, and because of cost, because of norms, probably technology the introduction of technology will be accelerated. But obviously, it's for service companies or knowledge. For the companies that use knowledge quite a bit, knowledge professions, use of technology will increase, and personal contact will probably decrease. Now, with that, I'm going to pass it over to Nicoleta, and I'm going to introduce or do a quick introduction here. Namely, in order to adapt to such an environment, procedures, documents in HR will need to be changed as well, and it will need to be adapted. We've done this over the last 10 years, so we have actually significant experience in the field. We kept for this slide the names of the documents in Romanian because they are referenced that way. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to you, Nicoleta, to cover this area.
Thank you, Silvian. So we are facing a new reality. And while COVID-19 suddenly put a stop to our old reality, the reality that we lived in, now with this transition from crisis to the new world, we have the opportunity to choose how we will act, and we have the opportunity to choose how to handle the proportions in which we are going to work. And I mean by this, work from home and work from office. Our 10 years experience in this remote work helped us a lot during this period. And the fact that we already had this habit, and that for our employees, this is the normal way of working, clearly gives us a huge advantage. Fortunately, with this experience, we also helped our clients to quickly and successfully implement this remote work in their organization. So this 10 years experience in working remote helped us to better understand how the things are going, how to manage the labor relations, how to communicate effectively with employees and customers, and what tools, communication tools, are more suitable for this. Also, this experience got us prepared in a less preferred aspect. The legislation, and we know that labor legislation, it's not quite fun, and it's rather difficult. And the necessary documents, we had it in place in advance. And I mean by internal regulations, collective agreements, internal decisions, addendums, specific procedures in this regard, internal notes, and the list can go on. Although these documents are encountered in every organization, or they should be, in this new context, in this new mix of work from home, work from office, the questions are, what format of these documents it's better to have? What specific rules and what are the most important aspects that we need to introduce in these documents, and I would like to offer you some examples in this regard. And I mean by timekeeping, performance evaluations, monitoring the work of our employees, information security, GDPR, who gave us a lot of headaches in the last couple of years, access to documents, and so on. So this 10 years experience helped us in advance to have all this in order. Of course, we are learning and we are adapting while we are finding new informations, new regulations, new recommendations from our authorities. I spent last night trying to find out the news, reading the new legislation that is applying starting with today. I'm sure that most of you already did that, and I want to point out the measurements that we need to take starting today. So in our workplaces, the recommendation is to keep working from home, and where this is not really a possibility, then we need to ensure that everyone is epidemiologically tested, and they refer this to check up the body temperature for all the staff and visitors, and this is going to be done at the control access points in the premises. Employers need to provide the employees and visitors with sanitizers from in that point of control access, and also we need to wear masks in the common spaces. We need to rearrange our offices in order to have the proper distance, 2 meters distance in between the physical desks, and we need to wear masks at all time. Of course, this is going to be hard on the employees to spend 8 hours in an office with masks on their nose and mouth, but this is the new reality. So when you decide to go back to work and you are having more than 50 employees, then you are going to rethink their starting hours. They need to have different starting hours in order to not put a lot of pressure on the traffic, on the public transportations, and so on. So they recommend to start or end the work schedule at the intervals of at least 1 hour during at least 3 hours in tranches of 20 or least 20% of personnel. It's important to keep working remote as much as we can to protect our health, to protect our businesses, and to have all the documents in order, to update them, because unfortunately there are going to be controls from our authorities, and I believe that they are going to check if the employers had the measurements, put it in place, and they are having the documents in order.
I'm going to interrupt you just 1 second, Nicoleta. So a couple of things that I want to reiterate here is that pretty much now a lot of companies will need to go through the same things. When we went through these changes in for our rules and our setup, we had to work with the legislation and sometimes on the edges of the legislation to make sure that our people can actually work flexible times, flexible hours, and so on. Even though a lot of companies will do that in the future, unless the law changes, it's still there is a potential for employees to take legal action, to challenge procedures and so on. So we anticipate that all these documents will need to be reviewed, changed. We do have the experience to know where actually these changes need to be made. How can they be referenced? How can they be positionings? What's the wording? So to prevent conflicts and obviously legal issues. The other thing that Nicoleta mentioned that's actually, I think, important is that in the past, we had problems, for example, with crowding during the rush hour. However, even though it was very inconvenient, we didn't change that. Companies did not go and say, well, let's say 20% of their personnel comes in at 8, then 20% at 9, 20% at 10, and 20% at 11. On the contrary, most companies have actually enforced that everybody starts at the same time. It's very likely that changes like this will actually need to be made, and companies can drive them, and they can drive these kind of changes. Again, for that, actually, procedures, processes, documents need to be changed. We didn't really have to do that because we allowed a flexible program, and even that actually to get it done within the current legislation in Romania, it required quite a bit of significant verbiage, procedures, so that people don't need to start and stop at an exact time. If you, most of you know that in Romania, actually, you need to record and report hours by law, and there's no such thing. For example, in California, we have what's called exempt and non-exempt, where non-exempt people, so that it's considered the regular type, they do record their hours, they get paid over time, they need to take breaks at certain times, whereas some people are exempt from these rules, and they are paid per year for certain work, not per hour, and they can work at any time. They are not entitled to overtime and so on. Now, because of the nature of work and professions, right now probably more than 50% of people are actually exempt, and it started with professional jobs like lawyers and doctors and architects and so on, and engineers. But right now it's most service organizations and quite a bit of other areas actually fall under the exempt category. And we in Romania, we don't even have that legislation. We cannot we cannot provide a fully flexible environment. But there are ways to actually tweak that to put in our processes, in our documentation, procedure paragraphs and perspectives to allow that. So anyway, I wanted to point that out. Back to you, Nicoleta.
Thank you, Silvian, for pointing these things. I would like to add the fact that starting from today, taking into consideration the new recommendations, in order to keep working from home, in Romanian language, it's referred like telemuncă. We need to have internal decisions in order to keep doing this. And of course, for our employees, we are going to need to have some addendums in order to keep doing this. So please pay attention to this and make sure that you are having the documents in order. Thank you, Silvian, back to you.
Sure. And what I want to add there is that for a while, probably we can get away, given the situation, we can get away with a few things, but eventually we might run into conflicts, legal issues, and so on. So it's much better to implement these changes in the procedures and documents as early as possible. And I'm going to mention this as well. we can assist companies with doing that. At Actas, Nicoleta is actually now actively engaged. Her team is actually actively engaged with a number of customers to assist them exactly with these kind of changes. Okay. And by the way, we can accelerate overall the cost of making changes when you come from a position of having done it before. It's obviously advantageous. Okay, good. Now, I'm going to now talk a little bit about productivity, profits, the changes in that regard. And we already mentioned a little bit that jobs will most likely be transformed, especially in terms of productivity. Quite a few jobs will no longer have the same, let's say, the same approach as they used to be. It will be in manufacturing, in retail, in services. Jobs will actually need to change because the way companies will service their customers will change. The way products are being developed, researched as well, it will change. So it's very likely that the nature of the jobs themselves will change, whether it's a clerk, whether it's a salesperson, and even in manufacturing. It's likely that rather than, for example, manufacturing as part of an assembly line or as part of a team, usage of robots, of automated work will actually increase. It's nothing new, by the way, as I was saying, but most people will actually end up servicing these machines and these tools, and quite a bit of those jobs will actually be remote. Now, the other area where we anticipate acceleration of the existing trends and therefore significant changes, marketing. It's whether we talk about advertising and consuming advertising, because people will be less time in the physical places. It's probably it will. We anticipate things like people will not want to touch magazines like they're being delivered, or pick a brochure, for example, in a public place or in public transportation because of concerns for contamination. People will make much more use of their personal devices, where they keep an eye on personally, and so on. Now, however, the need for marketing will probably not only stay the same, but it will probably increase. And by marketing, by the way, it's not just advertising; it's the interaction with the market, is constant changes because we're adapting, market research, communication to the markets, education both ways, to the market and from the market. All these things will actually need to be increased because the markets themselves are very likely to change. Now, I'm going to use two examples. Okay, one of them is Amazon. We think of Amazon right now as a giant successful company, but it has not always been like that. For the first 15 years of its existence, Amazon actually lost money. It was not a profitable company. They started actually as an online bookstore, and they implement technologies. And especially during 2009, they ended up being challenged financially. They do depend, for example, on delivery, on the post office. They did not have a delivery chain. Their business depending on establishing one, and so on. So I'm going to mention this. There are numerous studies that you can actually go over as well. During 2009, faced with decreasing income and the slump in economic activity, they actually ended up betting on innovation and making a deliberate decision to increase investment so that they actually grow market share. A number of the other players, notably Apple, who had actual product, for example, in the readers before, they took a more cautious approach, and Amazon actually got the upper hand. Another example is even from a previous recession, the 1990-91 recession. McDonald's decided to drop its advertising and the promotion budget. Taco Bell actually took advantage. They even went sometimes in the exact same slots that McDonald's abandoned, and they were able to increase their market share by about 40%. Now, what's also, and at the same time, McDonald's declined by 28%. Now, these trends were directly associated not with a change in products or customer preference, but the investment in marketing. And the trend actually continued, and it continued for years after that. And these are just two examples. We have actually, in the interest of time, we're not going over other case studies, but there are at least another 20 cases that we actually present. These are examples where companies may want to cautiously increase their investment in marketing in crisis situations. And I want I'm going to, over the next slides, actually talk a little bit more in depth about that. But before that, I want to mention one other thing that is important for productivity and profits, and that is financial transparency. And what's meant by that is transparency to employees. Whereas typically a lot of the employees or the standard approach is that the employees need to care about their particular job and their particular area, and output is not necessarily communicated or quantified. There's a general trend in the world, which we think again it will be accelerated, to have people become conscious of the financial value of their jobs and having it quantified. And in environments like this, where physical presence is less frequent, where there's a risk also for disconnect, having people having at the top of their mind the fact that their job actually hits the bottom line is a way to monitor and control and communicate productivity, adjust, optimize it, and keep an eye on profits. Okay? Now, going back for a second to marketing, and by the way, this is one of the areas of expertise for us. We think that the problem that we have now can actually be turned into an opportunity. And there are a couple of things that I want to mention here. That when competitors cut back on their marketing spend, that's an opportunity for companies to increase theirs. Again, that needs to be done cautiously and according to well-strategized plans. But it allows companies to actually enter a field where in normal times it's been very difficult to do. Now, it's also, it allows a company to reposition brands or introduce new products. And if we look historically, this crises have been very successful in, or the companies that have actually done that in a crisis have been very successful with such developments. Now, the other aspect that's important is that the cost of marketing drops during downtimes. So the lower rates and the lower demand actually creates a buyer's market, and especially direct mail provided greater short-term growth, because people tend to pay less attention when they get let's say a handful of ads compared to getting one or two, which then they tend to pay attention more to that. The other thing that I'm going to mention here is that in terms of image, companies that promote stability during challenging times end up creating a psyche about them and getting a favorable impression with their audiences. Now, in this regard as well, the converse happens as well. When marketers stop spending, they lose their share of mind, and it's not just going up and down. It's the fact that if people are used with a certain things with a certain, let's say, level, and that level decreases, it's very hard to pick that up. It gives the impression that something is wrong with that, or it's on the way down. And even if levels get back to where they were before, unless there are other tactics involved, the favorability does not get back to where it was. Now, again, the learning or the conclusion here is that again, while being disciplined, historically, advertisers who maintained marketing spend during down times, in the majority of cases, gained competitive advantage. Okay? And as I was saying before, it's much easier to increase market share during such a time than during strong economies where competition is just as strong. Now, I want to move on to the last topic that we have here, and that is digital tools. And I want to talk a little bit about that. Getting tooled for the changes to come is just as important. Conferencing tools have been now on everybody's mind. And I put together the Gartner Magic Quadrant. For those of you who are not familiar with Gartner, Gartner is a research company. And for the last maybe 20, 30, 40 years, they published what people got accustomed to call the Magic Quadrants. And obviously, the quadrant that the company wants to end up with is the quadrant of the leaders. And for conferencing, there are 4 companies that actually are, according to Gartner, in this area. And they are Cisco with WebEx, Zoom, which we're using right now, Microsoft with Teams, and LogMeIn, which has a technology called Join Me, who's actually quite competitive as well. Obviously, there are a couple of others. Google and Adobe are coming quite strong in the challengers area. But we look at typically these 4 companies. So in the end, the technologies being WebEx, Zoom, Teams, and Join Me to use for most of the conferencing needs. Now, it's not just the tools; it's a practice, it's an approach. It's if you want a habit to have people jump on the WebEx or on Zoom whenever they need to talk to somebody. And companies that, in our company, for example, what we've done quite religiously, so it became a second nature, is whenever you need to talk to somebody, immediately you look them up in Teams. We use Teams and WebEx for the majority of the time. We occasionally use Zoom or Join Me, but most of the time we use Teams and WebEx. And immediately we jump into let's say, Teams. We start a discussion, and it's just like walking to somebody else's desk. Obviously people can be in another discussion, so we monitor that as well. But we developed the habits to do that. You can ask somebody if they are available really quickly. If they are in a meeting, they might say, I'm available in 15 minutes. This habit or this way of working develops over time to where it becomes a second nature. Similarly, there are quite a few digital tools. I'm not going to go over them. I'm going to mention maybe a couple like Jira, for example, or Asana for project management and task management. And what we see also is a very strong use of specialized tools, whether they are, for example, for delivery, for transportation, for retail. We have actually assisted customers in developing such tools, but we think that now with again with exiting the pandemic, the adoption and the need of such tools will be increased. There are a number of specialized tools that enable working remote. I'm going to mention, for example, whether it, let's say in the insurance industry. Across from our office in Bucharest, there's a parking lot where there may be 15 or so RVs that sell insurance out of the parking lot. I always ask myself, why don't these people go online? We think that will actually happen, and therefore the insurance companies, for example, will need to provide the tools for agents, not just for customers, to conduct their business online. And obviously this is a specialized function. People ask themselves, well, why do I need an agent in that case? So these tools will actually need to be able to provide support, to provide guidance, some of it in person by having a person behind it, some of it automated. Now, also for people to be able to conduct work, they will no longer be able to go easily to another person, ask them. Obviously, they can still contact people online, but it's harder to see or to who's available at a given point, or to create, let's say, a group of 3 or 4 really quickly, even though that's possible as well. So the use of knowledge bases will need to increase, where people can actually consult, see, look at their internal procedures or internal knowledge. Interactions can be documented, so when people actually talk, they might record that and then post it so that other people can look it up, find it, search it, and use it. Now, a couple of obvious things. Again, we're not going to spend a lot of time with, but basic tools, like, for example, even having a laptop. Our national airline, I visited a couple of years ago, I think it was 2 years ago, and was talking to the head of IT, and he was telling me that only about a third of people there have access to computers and email. And I asked them, well, how do you communicate? And they physically take a paper, a memo from an office to another, and they walk it from a room to another. Obviously, that's something that will not be able to continue when people are not in the same building. So basic tools will need to be implemented. Now, in Romania, in general, most companies, or most, let's say, modern companies, do have all their people on email. The majority of people have mobile phones, but that will need to be done where pretty much everybody has that, whether a laptop or a pad or a mobile phone. Obviously, email and internet, that will need to happen. Now, the last thing that I have here on the list, which is important, is that internal support will need to increase. And not just IT support, but support for anything else, including HR support. So people will need to be able to, when they have a problem, to call somebody. If they are in the building, they can go and ask around, guys, what do you think? How do you solve this? How do you go that? Go to that person and ask them, and so on. That's less likely to work, or it's almost impossible to work when people are not physically there. And therefore, they will need to know where they get that kind of support. These channels need to be established for the different aspects of work. Okay. Now, I have a couple of slides left. I'm going to talk just a little bit about Retina and what we do. I'm not going to go in depth. I'm going to mention that we cover both creative and technology, and all that under the umbrella of strategy. I'm going to leave it at that. We're going to send this out when it's done. In terms of HR services and ACTAs, we do provide HR audit. We provide HR consultancy and HR outsourcing. And we do have a line of service where we also provide learning, training, and development of personnel. With that, I'm going to conclude here. These are the contacts. If you want to take a screenshot, we're also going to send the presentation, and the recording will be available. And I'm going to look at questions and answers. I'm going to go to actually Slido and put them on the screen. And let me actually make sure that I'm sharing that, because I think I'm not. Let me go to Zoom and make sure that I'm sharing the right contact. Okay, so that's it. Okay, so can somebody confirm that you can see how is the crisis different in various countries?
Yes, yes.
Okay, good, perfect, good. So I'm going to again, just briefly, I'm going to mention a couple of things. It's an interesting question. We are active in 6 countries right now, and we monitor that situation closely, and obviously a couple of other countries of interest. And what we see is that, for example, in California, where I'm right now, activity has continued, and namely because people are set up remotely. What we see in Romania, for example, we see some companies continue to work, but I would say, based on my observation, is that quite a few functions in society have stopped. And it's not just, for example, restaurants and retail. It's, for example, education. Based on my information, 9 out of 10 teachers have stopped teaching. They were never set up to do that. There are a few teachers in K to 12 as well as in higher education that have some interaction with their students, but for the most part, that has stopped. Here, both in business and in education, activity has actually continued at a very high level. Now, in Romania, for example, people have reported that productivity is still high, but I would question it from this perspective. Productivity is defined as output of work in the unit of time. I think that what we see is, for a week, productivity may be the same or increased, but not per hour. What happens is that people put more hours. One of the reasons is because they have nothing else to do, and they can't go in the evening anywhere or during the weekend. But if that is the case, and again, it's too early to tell for sure, we don't know. But if that is the case, that means that people put actually more hours, and therefore the output for the entire week is higher, but not per hour. And if that's the case, actually productivity has decreased. Again, it's too early to tell what's what, but that's a perspective that we might want to take into consideration. If we get back to where people can, let's say, travel or spend time outdoors in the evenings, in the weekends with their family, or do other things, then the number of hours will decrease, and then again we'll need to consider productivity per hour, not per week. So obviously there are other aspects in crisis or between countries. I would say that literacy or the usage of digital tools will be critical, and also the capability to change, to adapt to changes. So that's where we see most differences. We could also, in theory, talk about how government handle it and so on, but that's a moot point. Maybe I'm going to mention one other aspect here that has to do with the way governments handle financial aspects of the crisis. In a number of countries, including Romania, people have actually focused on how we can help individuals weather this situation. The problem is created by that is that if you give people money to whether they work or not, or especially for those that do not work, that becomes an incentive to not work, and that's actually may backfire, may actually result in the opposite. It might extend the crisis rather than solve it. In the US, there have been two efforts. One of them is actually to give everybody, all citizens, a small amount of money. It's actually exactly $1,200. But also the larger amount has been given to companies who keep their operations going. Some of these companies were confronted with a dilemma, just like in Romania, where some people said, look, I get more money if I don't work, so why would I work? But overall, there's been already a couple of $1 trillion, so per person, actually significant money that went to companies to keep their operations going. And now there's a program in Romania as well, the IMM Invest. However, it's still in its early phases. Banks just signed; they had the up until today to put their programs in place, and there are very, very few companies that actually got any money. So it's just starting right now. So we see here differences in the approaches on, and I think the important thing is that governments will actually need to provide incentives, but the incentives can be either to return to work or to actually get help to, which is on the let's say humane level. It makes sense. We want to reduce let's say poverty or impact or suffering, but at the same time, if we provide incentives for people not to work, most likely we will see some individuals not wanting or not having reasons to return to work. Okay, and obviously there are maybe many other aspects that we'll see in the future. What I would also add there is that there's something that's in common as well between different countries, and that the crisis is extremely politicized in all countries. Now, the next question I'm going to take: what can we do if our employees no longer want to travel for work? That's an interesting thing, because it's not just travel; it's a lot of other things. They might not want to come to the office. They might not want to go to a public or government institution to file papers. And whereas even before, maybe people didn't really like to go there, but they did. Now we might end up with people refusing to do that. So I'm not going there. I heard that they had a few cases of coronavirus, or it's very crowded, and they will refuse to go there and to travel. And quite frankly, my opinion, that's an opinion, it's not necessarily a fact, is that we might need to go along with that and find solutions that do not require travel or not require physically going there. And probably there will be an industry developing, like there are already individuals that aid with that, but probably that will extend. However, we'll need to lobby, and actually in Romania that we don't have an environment to lobby. We need to advocate, let's put it this way, so I don't run into any issues. We need to advocate to government agencies to digitize, to allow every single thing that requires somebody to go in person somewhere to be conducted remote. And by the same token, with travel to service our customers, for example, or to engage in sales, or to provide service on site, that wherever possible, that will need to be avoided. I'm going to give another example, because there are cases where you can't. For example, if somebody has let's say a gas leak at home, somebody will need to go to the home to fix it. Or another example is, let's say the internet stops and they call the cable company to fix it. Somebody will need to physically go there. Now, what I've seen actually in this particular case is companies provide a solution where their representative comes to the house. They leave a device with a camera, and they instruct then somebody from the household to do that. Obviously, they can do that to fix the network. They will probably not do that to fix a gas pipe, because that can result in serious consequences. But the solutions like this will most likely develop, and for travel, we'll need to find alternatives. And with that in mind, travel is very likely to. Let's go to the next question. What budget should we expect for changing HR documents and procedures? Very good question. I would recommend that to be approached incrementally. And I would set aside a few $1,000s, maybe $10,000 for a review and changing the basic documents. And part of that review is one deliverable is to identify what other documents need to be changed. And then if the budget is available, then that can be done. If not, then those changes will need to be prioritized. So the more important ones will need to be taken with a higher priority. I would recommend, but let me actually say this first. We recommend it for companies to do HR reviews periodically anyway. And if you don't do that, most people do it after they get sued. Whenever they encounter a significant problem, that's when they end up doing a review. We recommend that it's much cheaper to do it ahead of time. And it's just like with, let's say, automobile insurance. You want to make sure that you have it before you have an accident, not after. And having said that, I think that a budget of anywhere between 5 to 10K in euros in this particular case, so 5,000 to 10,000 euros, or dollars if you want to talk dollars, is where to start. And then part of that actually do not just change the documents, but do an audit and the list, and then the rest of them can be prioritized if there is a need. Okay. And by the way, Nicoleta, do you think that's reasonable? Do you have anything to add in that, since it's your specialty rather than mine?
No, it's okay. You cover it. You cover it well. Of course, it's important first of all to assess what you have, and then to start updating the documents and prioritize in the customer's specific.
Okay, good. So, which sectors of the economy are likely to recover the fastest, US versus Romania? I think that obviously anything that has to do with tools to get out of the crisis will probably recover the fastest. So there are things like conferencing tools or integration or digital tools. There's a very strong need for that. If you probably follow the stock market, you probably noticed that quite a few of these companies had their stock go up, and that's probably proof of that. Now, in other areas, there will be things that are needed. For example, retail will need to recover. There are, for example, delivery. It has already increased significantly. It's interesting that in Romania, Uber Eats, for example, just exited the market at a time when there's probably an increased demand for that. A lot of the other areas probably they're speculative, and we'll need to wait and see. People talk more about the sectors that will probably not recover, or will take longer time to recover, which are tourists, for example, and entertainment as well. That's a quite large sector, but the basic services, I think, will need to continue, and they will need to recover. And food production, now we have a drought as well in Romania that's going to be problematic, but most likely that will recover. We're a little bit over time, but I'm going to really quickly address these last two questions. I think this means what is the first thing we should do about the pandemic. If I had the choice, I would say the first thing to do is reopen the economy and go back to work, and make sure that we go back to the products, the services that we were providing, and adapt them. And I would say maybe even the second one is make sure that we have the infrastructure, especially for our people, and that's what I would say about HR, to make sure that we can continue. We have the infrastructure, the framework to continue. And I would say the third one is to make sure we communicate with our markets. We let our customers know that we continue to be there to service them and adapt. Okay. And the last question that I have: what infrastructure support is needed to support the shift to at-home workforce? We need to be prepared to budget their electricity, internet bill. We actually already pay for internet, mobile, and so on. We cover internet at home as well, and we are actually actively involved. There are other aspects that I want to stress. That security, extremely important to have security. Hacking will probably increase in such an environment, and also education for that. Electricity, it's questionable, though. Everything that we use these days, unless people use manufacturing at home, uses very little electricity. So again, we'll see how that works, but it's unlikely that we'll need to cover electricity. It's likely that we need to cover internet and security and so on. In the case, for example, here, maybe that's an interesting aspect here in California and Silicon Valley. Companies used to provide food at work, and they've actually started providing food at home. That's actually not a perk that is allowed because of taxation. So that ran into legal issues, and it's not that companies didn't want to; they were not allowed to do that. So if we pay for people's electricity electricity, by the way, in certain countries, that the people, governments will actually question whether it's taxable or not. But anyway, I think that electricity will probably not happen. Internet, most likely, yes. Okay, good. So with that, we covered the questions as well. Thank you very much for everybody for attending. I hope that this was useful. And thanks to the Handelskammer for organizing this.
Thank you for preparing this presentation for us, Mr. Centiu, and to the attendees, of course, thank you for joining us. As mentioned earlier, we will send the presentation and the recording of the webinar. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.